And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection. I'm your host, Robert Pictou. Registered psychologist Dr. Jennifer Mervyn's use of traditional Indigenous approaches to counseling and her commitment to enduring Indigenous youth have a voice has helped transform relationships between Indigenous children, their parents, their communities, the police, mental health, and primary care professionals across British Columbia. On today's Open Connection, Dr. Jennifer Mervyn.
I grew up in North Delta, of all places. A little bit in Surrey, but mostly in North Delta was most of my youth and childhood spent. Until I was in my teenage years, and then spent a little bit more time in Vancouver and moved to Montreal when I was 17. I grew up, I was the oldest of 3 children, and it was tough times. My family definitely comes from some legacies of intergenerational trauma, and so my parents struggled, like really struggled with us. So especially as the oldest, there was an awful lot of pressure, I think, to be able to help out with my younger siblings and keep them safe. And I, definitely probably failed my family in that respects, because I ended up as a street kid downtown Vancouver in my teenage years doing hair wraps, and my sisters followed in my footsteps, sadly. So it was tough at home. It was really tough at home. So we were kind of looking for an escape and a place not to be there. One of my saving graces has actually been like a strong sense of spirituality since I was young. Since I was very young, I always had a connection to Creator that probably kept me safe and kept me alive and kept me strong with my values. I think like where it was very easy to be young and female and to fall into the sex trade, I was spared so much of that because I had such a strong sense of who I was in relation to my values and my spirituality and connection to Creator. So that probably spared me so much being on the streets as a young person. But definitely in terms of like searching for something and looking for connection and belonging, and like you said, filling it with things like drugs and alcohol. And for me, it was the street life culture was so attractive to me because it felt like connection and belonging and family. And I grew up with watching Cheers, and when like Norm would come into the bar and everyone would be like, Norm. When I'd go on this one certain section of the street downtown Vancouver, everyone would say, Jen. And I felt connected there, and I felt beautiful and like I belonged, and people wanted to be around me, and that there's something so good in that sense of belonging and connection. But it wasn't healthy. I mean, in the long run, I could see through it. But in those moments when I was young, I spent a lot of time with those people. And sadly, one by one, they died. I mean, the life and the lifestyle it's rough. The boy I was dating had died, and that was a really tough time for me. He overdosed. And then there was another girl that I had worked with that had overdosed and died. And I think just death all around you, it's, you're there because of a sense of connection and belonging. And then when you start to lose people left, right, and center, it was so incredibly hard. And I kind of knew that if I stayed in the city, that it was so much of a draw for me there that I wouldn't leave. So I knew I had to leave the province. Well, they had a great psychology program, and I'd spent a couple of my summers there in my teenage years and fell in love with Montreal and just thought it was great, and you could drink at 18 legally there. So really, if I'm honest, it was fun, and I loved the language. It's interesting because my great-grandmother spoke French, Michif, and Sioux, and I never had been exposed to French really until my grade 8 year, but by grade 9 I could pretty much speak it fairly fluently, and they always told me that was like blood memory, and I wanted to be around language, and so I moved to Montreal. My last 2 years of high school, I was starting to skip out, get in trouble. It was really stressful at home. Lots of like MCFD involvement in my house with my younger siblings, lots of violence, lots of stress and trauma. And I think my teachers in high school thought that I was just like understimulated and not being challenged enough. And so I was doing a program called Concurrent Studies. So they'd given me undergraduate psychology courses to do in high school. And so I'd started to learn a little bit more about psychology in my grade 11 and 12 years. And I had a wonderful teacher who was very kind to me, and she started teaching me things like mindfulness and meditation and progressive muscle relaxation. And it helped a lot regulate my feelings and help me be present and cope without needing substances. And I just thought, wow, like this is such a gift and I want to learn more about it. And I really think this is what I want to do. So it was the start really of like making those little seeds and planting them for my future career.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. Psychology is a field dedicated to studying the human mind and using that understanding to help individuals, couples, and families strengthen their relationships, overcome challenges, and enjoy a higher quality of life. Let us return to the conversation as Dr. Mervyn shares why she chose psychology as a career.
I think so much of my early career had to do with my own personal healing story. I did my master's research looked at what were the critical incidents that helped people leave street life, because I wanted to understand myself better. How did I do this? How do I help others? What are the important pieces we need to be able to help promote healing? And so I really focused on that. And then in my doctoral research, looked at it even a little bit more deeply, but truly I think where I started off and where I am now in terms of looking at the bigger picture and understanding how people really heal, I've come a long way, and my ideas, my theories, my theoretical orientation has changed a million times. In my undergrad degree, I got a job in mental health right away, so I was doing working in residential settings with people with acute psychiatric illness. So I felt like always throughout my whole time in school, I was always working full time to pay for it, which you're not really supposed to do. There's residency requirements that say you're not supposed to work full time and do graduate level work, but I always had a full-time job, and I learned so much from practically applying what I was doing all the way through. I worked, I had great jobs. I finished my master's degree. I was hired on by the health authority, and I carried a pager back in the day. Do you remember pagers? So old school. And I carried this pager, and I was on call to the 4 emergency rooms of the South Fraser region. So whenever a youth presented to the emergency room with any mental health crisis, I would get in my car, drive out, and do their mental health assessment, safety planning, suicide risk assessment. And if they're discharged, I would do their follow-up counseling in the community. And it was one of the most incredible training grounds to set me up for being able to do fantastic assessments, really know mental health inside and out. And I'm so grateful for that today. And then I was mentored by people in this multidisciplinary setting, doctors, psychiatrists, nurses, social workers, all to give me a different perspective and a different lens on how to approach that young person in front of me. So I feel like I was so well trained. I am so grateful for that experience there. I left emergency room work when I wanted to have babies of my own, because I thought 12-hour shifts and it's a little much if you're starting a family. And I went to work for MCFD in child and youth mental health for a number of years, which was also great because I got to work with vulnerable families that can't afford to pay for a psychologist in private practice. And I was able to do some really cool things there. I don't think that we can always just take our book learning. Some people are fantastic at memorizing every word that's in that book, but if you don't have the heart and the soul and the passion and compassion to be able to bring that and infuse it into the work you do, you might be a terrible psychologist. So I think so much of my training ground has been with just experiences, yes, I've got some 3 degrees, but I've also got my years in the field in working with people and understanding their stories and seeing what works and trying things on and coming back to the drawing board. And I think for me, it has been constantly sort of taking this stance of humility, and that like I'm learning alongside every person that I help support, right? We're learning and we're working on this together collaboratively. I'm not some person who has all the answers. I really am not. But I'm there to help you figure out what those answers might be for you, and I can help support you, and I have some really cool ideas and tools in my tool belt that I can share with you and teach you. But I'm still learning right alongside you and trying things out and trying them on for size and supporting you through that. I think, one of the really cool things that I believe culturally, spiritually, that always like impressed almost like a burden of responsibility or accountability, but also like so much hope, is that yes, as Indigenous people, I think we do carry intergenerational trauma. We carry the burdens and the terrible traumatic events that have happened to our ancestors. But I also really believe, that time isn't so linear like Western thought really encourages us to consider. I think that as an Indigenous person, we see time as really circular. And, if we take the time to embark on our own healing journey, if we can actually take the time to heal ourselves and pass that healing on to the next generation. If I become a better human being and a mom now, and I can be a better mom to my kids, they're going to be better parents to their children one day. It's going to have this beautiful ripple effect that will go down generation after generation. But as an Indigenous person, I also would actually believe it goes back and heals our ancestors. My grandmothers and grandfathers and great-grandmothers and great-grandfathers, that healing doesn't just go forward, but it can actually reach backwards and help restore the hope in the souls that were so terribly hurt by colonization and other practices that were cruel and traumatic. And I think that's pretty cool. Wow, I have this capability to be able to actually do some good for my ancestors that suffered through so much. That's pretty powerful.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. Committed to teaching the next generation of healthcare practitioners on how to provide culturally informed and safe counseling in Indigenous communities, Dr. Mervyn uses a number of techniques, including sweat lodges, sharing circles, and elders to speak to her classroom to connect with developing practitioners. Let us return to the conversation with Dr. Mervyn.
So I was teaching multicultural counseling, and I read it out to my students that day. The interesting history there for me is I was actually facilitating a youth conference in the Kamloops residential school years ago. And I can tell you that I remember my moments there because it actually impacted me long before this news came out. We're talking years ago. I was there, and on our breaks, youth would walk me from room to room in that residential school that's reclaimed and being used for band activities. And they would say, my auntie got raped in this room. My uncle was beaten over here. And they knew the spaces and places where their relatives were so traumatized and abused. And the darkness and heaviness I felt in my heart leaving Kamloops after that conference was just ominous. It was really, really hard on me. And it took a long time to shake and be able to leave my spirit and my energy, because I was like, why haven't they burned that place to the ground? It is so dark, the energy is so terribly dark there. And then to see the news, it just sort of all fell in place. It was, the sad thing is I think for Indigenous people, it's not shocking. We knew that these were the atrocities that happened, but for Canada to be able now to validate and recognize what has happened, I think will hopefully move us forward. Because until we validate the trauma that we've been through, we stay stuck, we stay in pain. And for other people to recognize it and acknowledge it, that's when we have hope to be able to move forward and move through the pain. Not only why the behaviors happened, or why I made some of the foolish decisions I may have made in my misspent youth, but also oh my gosh, and this is what set me up for healing. I can actually see these amazing pieces that I never really understood, like this PE teacher that would teach me progressive muscle relaxation and how to calm my nervous system. And now here I am all these years later teaching people about the neuroscience of trauma and how to quiet their nervous system. So I feel like I was set up for success in so many ways that all culminated me being here today. And for that, I am so deeply grateful and honored. And that's why I also feel like, not a burden, but like a responsibility to make sure that we get this message out in terms of how we can heal, and to bring and deliver a message of hope that we all have this possible. And it's for everybody, that message of hope and healing. It is possible for all of us. I think it's so much easier for us to look upon people in judgment, right? And I think that I truly believe if we are looking at that person who is drunk or who is homeless or struggling with addiction, I always use, it's an old NA thing, but the one finger pointing out is 3 fingers pointed back at us. And that's that, we need to be very careful about our judgments and our lack of compassion in this world, because what's going on, what is sick in us that causes us to be so unkind in our vision of other people? We all have a story. We haven't walked a mile in their shoes, and we can't judge others. We really can't. We need to be so careful about those judgments, because typically it reveals some sort of unhealed part in ourselves and in our own hearts. The more we can love ourselves, the more kindness and love and compassion we have for us, the more we have for other people. And I think people don't understand that. They think, well, I can do so much for other people and I can put myself last, and it doesn't really work like that, right? But when we have so much love to give and offer ourselves, when we can be kind and compassionate and non-judgmental for the choices we've made or how we've struggled or the morning we've had with our kids, whatever it might be, if we can be kind to ourselves about those things, we will have so much more to give to others throughout the day.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
The word for hospitality in German is Gastfreundschaft, which literally means guest friendship. Besides connecting food, sharing, and community, the word is understood as a philosophical term. In this final segment of Open Connection, Dr. Mervyn shares her thoughts if the doorbell rings at 5 p.m.
I mean, we're here because we're talking about how do we help support vulnerable people in Terrace. And I would love for people to look at how they first support and love themselves. So I have this, sorry, I'm touching my microphone. I have this metaphor that I often use because I do this. I travel, I'm away for a few days from home, and when I come back, no one is filling my fridge with milk and bread and eggs, and it's gone by the time I get home with 3 kids. So I'm usually like, oh my goodness, if I've just got off a flight, I'm just coming home, and my doorbell rings at 5 p.m. I'm like, don't answer it. We have no food. We can't offer anybody anything. So don't answer. And it's really different because I love being a good host, and I love people, and I love them coming into my home. And if I've just gone to Costco, like Costco's where I overshop, I can't even close my fruit and veggie drawers after I go to Costco. There's bread on the counters and croissants in a warehouse style pack. And if someone rings my doorbell at 5 o'clock after my Costco run, bring them in. Is there anyone with them? Come on, invite them in. I can't even, close my fridge here. Please invite them in for food. And it's that metaphor of, if we have enough love for ourselves first, and compassion and forgiveness and kindness, if we can love us, then we'll have so much to be able to give away to others. But if we have very little and we're hard on ourselves and critical and judgmental with us, then we have to keep what little we have just for us. So it's going to be easy for us to judge other people. And so I guess I would really love everyone just to think about how can I be the best me today, this week, before you think about how you're going to reach out and help transform this community. It just starts with one person at a time. How can I be more loving? How can I be more non-judgmental? How can I be more compassionate to myself in my own home, to my family, to my friends, and to my social circle? How can I build support in my life and do the things that take away some of my stress? How am I going to get out in that fresh air and look at those beautiful mountains and get a walk in? How am I going to get to the airport tomorrow but still get a hike in the morning to be able to be in nature and know that my blood pressure will be decreased if I can do that for me? Because those are the things that fill my soul and decrease my stress and make me a better human being, which makes me a better mom and friend and psychologist. Because we are social beings, our health is actually dependent on interactions with other people. It's dependent on it. And that's our psychological health, our physical health and our spiritual health. Loneliness, for sure, we know impacts us in a negative way. And in fact, it can actually shrink different areas of our brain. One of the interesting studies that I read that looked at this was when they sent a team of 9 people to Antarctica. They did brain imaging studies before they went and when they came back, and they measured what happened to their brains. And the area that was most affected in their brain is the hippocampus. And it's very interesting because the hippocampus is also an area of the brain that gets impacted when we experience childhood trauma. What happens is it actually shrinks. People who are isolated and away and stuck up in the north for over a year by themselves, they actually lose that part of their brain. It gets smaller, it shrinks, and decreases in volume overall. So I think it's really interesting to know that physically there's a change when we don't have social interactions and physical touch and connections with other people. And it can actually be toxic, right? There can be weakened areas of the way our neurons and our synapses grow is using a special brain protein. I'm trying to remember what brain protein, I think it's BDNF. And BDNF helps new synapse and neuron formation. And we actually know, because of that group that went to Antarctica, that we actually don't have as much of that brain protein, which means we are not as able or capable of making new neurons, new synapses when we are socially isolated. Isn't that fascinating? So our brains are deeply impacted when we're not in connection or community with other people. The other thing that I think is really interesting is what happens to us psychologically. So we've really studied a lot what happens to people in jails. And we know that self-harm increases by 50% when people in jail are put in solitary confinement, self-harming behaviors. So there's a huge impact in terms of how we experience isolation socially. What can we do about it? Well, we need to think about how we exercise as part of our brains. So that area in our brains, especially around like the ventral striatal area, it gets stimulated with things like food and love. Well, guess what? It also gets stimulated with human interaction.
The one thing that I would love to explain is that, in psychology, we used to talk a lot about self-esteem, right? How do we feel better about ourselves? And self-esteem is become an old concept. Now, we don't use it anymore because self-esteem is really great for you when you have it, but it's so based on comparing ourselves to others. And oh my gosh, with social media and all the pressures in society right now about social comparison, comparing our bodies, comparing what we have, it's so material driven and it's so fake. And I think, if we can shift away from self-esteem and how good we feel about ourselves in comparison to others and start thinking about how we can deepen our self-compassion, our self-kindness, and our self-love, that's when we'll see change and growth and better communities because we'll see better people.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but a connection from his mind to his heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.